In their quest for wealth and power, they destroy lives and desolate cities. Building an empire has always been a bloody business. From the beginning of time, history's most powerful men set out to conquer the world and let nothing stand in their way.
Our concept of wealth and power changes with civilization. Today, men and women try to conquer the business world. Centuries ago, the most ambitious tried to conquer the entire world. Our program looks at some of history's remarkable conquerors: Alexander, Napoleon, Genghis Khan. When wealth was measured in military victories and nations conquered, they were far and away the world's wealthiest men and the most brutal.
He was a charismatic young king and a brave warrior in search of glory. Alexander the Great believed he was chosen by the gods to lead his people. In 336 BC, Alexander inherited the kingdom of Macedonia, the largest, most affluent nation in the Greek Empire. At the age of 20, he controlled one of the greatest armies in the world. He led a cavalry numbering over 1,800 men, an army of more than 40,000, and set out on a campaign through his kingdom. But a rumor of Alexander's death spurred a revolt in the city of Thebes. Alexander marched over 200 miles and demanded the city surrender. When they refused, Alexander attacked. He destroyed the city, ordered 6,000 killed, sold survivors into slavery.
You have what you could call the principle of the economy of violence, which is if you take over a city, first thing you do is you execute some people. And you show that you're willing to do it. And if you do it right away, you don't have any more trouble.
Alexander had proved his dominance of the Greeks, but it wasn't enough. He set his sights on the incredible wealth of the Persian Empire just to the east, a land his father had tried to conquer before him. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander led his army on a bloody campaign into Persia. But he did more than just command his regiments and battalions. Alexander fought side by side with the best of his men.
He was in the field with them, eating the same dust every day that they ate and suffering the same thirst and the same deprivation. They loved that in their ruler.
He worked as hard, if not harder, than any of his men, and that's obviously something that people who fought with him liked.
Alexander strengthened that loyalty when he fulfilled the prophecy of the Gordian knot. The age-old legend promised all of Asia to the one man who could untangle the huge knot tied with no visible end. Alexander sliced through it with his sword and declared himself Lord of Asia. It was a prophecy he would fulfill. Alexander set off with his army and conquered from the Mediterranean all the way to India. En route, he established more than 70 new cities, many of them named, not surprisingly, Alexandria.
Up to the time of Alexander, most cities were concentrated around a palace, a fortress, or a temple. But when Alexander founded new cities in North Africa or in the middle of Asia, he founded them on the Greek model. They were cities of commerce. So he spread the idea of commerce, and he helped us start modernizing a very archaic world.
He put Greeks and Macedonians firmly in control and left them to rule as he and his army moved on. By 330 BC, Alexander dominated all of the Persian Empire. His unprecedented power led him to believe he was more than human. Alexander thought of himself as a god.
You have to understand that in those days, except for the Jews, nobody believed in a god who couldn't be human. The Greek myths are full of people who became gods, and he's in the process of dominating absolutely everywhere. So it's not too illogical a step for him to be seized, the more powerful he gets, with this vision of himself as a living God.
Alexander launched one more campaign in the spring of 327 BC, leading 35,000 troops into India. It would be his last conquest. The brave commander, who had survived years of combat, died of a sudden fever in 323 BC. He was 33 years old. Alexander's vast empire quickly crumbled as his generals and commanders grappled for power. But the man who came to be known as Alexander the Great achieved in death what he couldn't quite in life.
There were romances written about him, there were monuments created, and he was, certainly after his death, he became a godlike figure that was worshipped as probably no other ruler in the ancient period.
He lived at a time when the people hardly knew their neighbor in the next valley, much less all the way across the other continent. So Alexander brought the world together. He founded new cities, and he took this thing of Greek culture and began to spread it around the world. Greek values, Greek learning, and the Greek system of commerce.
But not all legendary rulers are celebrated for their good deeds. Some are better remembered for their atrocities. None more so than the brutal warrior who descended from the Mongolian mountains to build what would eventually become the largest land empire in all of history. Mongolia lies in Central Asia, a vast expanse of forests, mountains, and desert, landlocked between the borders of Russia and China. Much of the country looks today as it did thousands of years ago, when nomadic herdsmen lived off the land. There were few riches to be found in these barren steppes, and warring Mongol tribes battled one another for the only thing they had: land. It took one man to change all that. He was born in Mongolia around 1162. His birth name was Temujin, meaning iron. But as his empire grew larger, he became known as the Universal Ruler, or Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan arises out of a context of warrior tribes. And warrior tribes are essentially based on the same principle that the Romans were, which is either you dominate or you are dominated.
Genghis understood that principle well. He built a loyal following by generously sharing his horses, his clothing, and his food. Proved his ability as leader by ruthlessly killing those who opposed him. By the age of 40, Genghis had united warring Mongol tribes into one of the toughest, most ferocious armies ever seen. It ravaged cities, looted treasures, and in the process, built an empire that stretched across the continent of Asia. Genghis harnessed the natural skills of his nomadic warriors. Mobility was the secret weapon of his invincible army.
They could attack settlements or villages or towns and then flee into the steppelands and not be fearful of being pursued by people who didn't have that kind of mobility.
Genghis Khan's army traveled swiftly from one area to the next, appearing from nowhere and plundering everything in its path. Not even a lack of basic necessities like food and water slowed them down.
One of the things that they are renowned for was pricking the skin of a horse. Blood would sputter forth, and they would drink up the blood, and that would keep them going.
Genghis Khan relied upon the extraordinary stamina of his army when he launched his first campaign outside Mongolia. In 1209, he attacked northern China. Genghis crossed the Gobi Desert, traveling 600 miles with an army of 75,000 men. He conquered the northern province of Xishan, and in 1214 he surrounded the Chinese capital of Zhongdu and starved its inhabitants into submission. They were forced to eat human flesh to survive. A year later, they surrendered.
This is extraordinary. Breaching the Great Wall, driving hundreds of miles into China. There's nothing that convinces a soldier of the power and the legitimacy of a war leader than success. And I think that probably that Chinese campaign did this for Genghis Khan.
But his power was neither as organized nor as permanent as that of Alexander the Great. He didn't set up administrations or governments. Genghis and his armies traveled from one territory to the next, plundering, conquering, and moving on.
And as soon as you raid one city and you sack it, then in order to get food for the next campaign, you have to go raid another city. So once you start it, you can't stop.
Genghis Khan was propelled by two things: necessity and revenge. In 1218, the Persian Shah Muhammad brutally murdered Mongol ambassadors visiting on a trade mission. "I was not the instigator of these tribulations," Genghis is rumored to have said. "Grant me the strength to exact vengeance." A year later, he led his army on a vicious crusade through the Persian lands in Central Asia. The strongest of cities fell in just days.
He would come to a city and it would be a very simple choice. The city could surrender and be saved, or if they fought, they would be annihilated.
Genghis ruthlessly murdered men, women, and even children. He burned buildings, plundered treasuries, and left mile after mile of land in ruins. In some cities, he marched prisoners in front of the army and used them as a buffer to attack the next city.
If the city had a moat, for example, then the civilians would be pushed into that moat in order to fill it up so that the army could come forward. It was quite a vicious form of warfare.
In 1226, Genghis Khan led one final campaign back into China. It was during that siege that he died of an unknown illness. He was 65 years old. Genghis Khan's greatest legacy was in building an empire that helped facilitate trade between Europe and the East.
The Mongol Empire provided a safe road for traders and people like Marco Polo to travel to China. And it was the West's first introduction to the wonders of the East.
Genghis Khan's sons divided his empire and went on to create new dynasties in Russia, India, Iran, and China. As they expanded across Asia, the Mongols battled against the Ottoman Turks, one of the world's richest dynasties. The Ottoman Empire lasted for over 600 years, reaching its peak under the rule of a man so rich and powerful, he proclaimed himself Sultan of the world. To this day, the 15th century palace of the Ottoman Sultan sits high up on a hill in Istanbul, Turkey. From inside these walls, they ruled the powerful Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. But the golden age of the Ottomans came under a sultan whose celebrated reign lasted an incredible 46 years. His name, Suleiman the Magnificent. Like Alexander the Great, Suleiman inherited his wealth and power from his father. In 1520, his empire included parts of Europe, Asia Minor, Syria, Upper Mesopotamia, Arabia, and Egypt. His powerful government was based on efficient administration, run less like a military stronghold and more like an organized bureaucracy.
He was the very first Ottoman ruler to make sure that power devolved not around the person of the Sultan, but had become somewhat impersonal through codes, through ritual, through ceremonial, through organized forms of behavior that did not depend on a singular person.
And in a way, that's beginning to show us what the future is going to be. Going to be countries that are based around bureaucracies, around great civil administration. In that regard, Suleiman the Magnificent is a very modern person.
He controlled his empire from the huge Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a sprawling compound of endless rooms, mosques, and minarets, a hospital, and a school. A staff of almost 20,000 worked within the confines of its walls. Nearly 5,000 lived there on a daily basis.
The Topkapi Palace was probably the most magnificent building ever built, with the greatest amount of wealth ever housed in any one building in the world.
Walls of gold, silver, and thousands of ornate tiles sheltered the dazzling riches of the empire. Suleiman skillfully used all of it to project an image of his power and magnificence to all who visited.
The way it projects power and magnificence is not through grand architecture, but the costumes, the jewels, the very expensive tile works, all of those would constitute the most important material objects with which he would live lavishly and project magnificence to others.
The splendor of Suleiman's influence spilled over the palace walls and onto the battlefield. During the first 2 years of his reign, he led 2 great conquests that struck at the heart of Europe. In 1521, Suleiman invaded Hungary. He marched into Belgrade and secured the lands along the Danube River. A year later, he attacked the great fortress at Rhodes and took control of the Aegean Sea. His navy was the dominant force on the Mediterranean. It raided coastal towns in Italy and Spain and dealt a crushing blow to the European fleet. Suleiman's victories nearly doubled the size of his empire and shaped his image as the protector and ruler of Islam. He was called Suleiman the Lawgiver for his role in refining ancient codes of Islamic law, and revered as Suleiman the Magnificent for his influence over European politics and his generous patronage of the arts. Suleiman brought the Ottoman Empire to its creative peak. He sponsored art, culture, and architecture, and used his great wealth to bring the best artists and poets to Istanbul. I know of no state which is happier than this one, wrote a Venetian ambassador. It is furnished with all God's gifts. It controls war and peace. It is rich in gold, in people, in ships, and in obedience. Obedience was expected, and Suleiman controlled his country with whatever force was needed.
Suleiman the Magnificent, like other sultans, kept a group of deaf mutes who were trained to kill. And Suleiman used them repeatedly against his own officers and even against his own sons. In one case, he watched himself while the deaf mute strangled his own son. That was a harsh man. He lived in a very harsh world, but he was able to rule this empire very effectively.
Suleiman the Magnificent, Sultan of the world, died of an illness in 1566. He was 72 years old. The golden age of the Ottoman Empire ended when Suleiman died. The government became weaker, territories were lost, and suddenly global power shifted to the great nation-states of Europe. Across the Mediterranean Sea, a young boy inherited the kingdom of France and went on to create an image of the world's most glorious king. His reign lasted for 72 years, the longest in European history. But his wealth and power were not as grand as they might have seemed.
By the time you get to Louis XIV, you're really in an era when you're talking about rule by public impression and celebrity, that he wasn't a great conqueror. He wasn't even a great administrator, but he knew how to dress. He appeared to be a glamorous person, and it was almost the beginning of the cult of celebrityhood, way back there in his time. There's nothing like the great conquest of Genghis Khan, nothing like the law-giving abilities of Solomon.
Louis was only 15 in 1654 when he was crowned sovereign of more than 19 million French subjects. The kings who ruled before him relied heavily on the advice of their ministers. But when Louis was only 23 years old, he bucked tradition and declared that he would now rule by himself. For 54 more years, he immersed himself so deeply in every aspect of his kingship that he was known to say, "L'État, c'est moi. I am the state." He was hailed by the people of Paris as Louis the Grand, known throughout Europe as the Sun King. It was a fitting symbol. As the sun gives life to all things, King Louis believed he gave life to his country.
He believed very much in this craft of being a king. He spent 6 to 8 hours behind the desk reading dispatches. He was a great believer in the majesty of kingship and did a great deal to design an image of himself as a great king.
He was probably somebody that most people today would have found rather rigid, very aloof, rather difficult. But of course, as far as Louis was concerned, these characteristics were part of the majesty of kingship, and he didn't regard being a ruler as somebody who went round being a chum.
Though he lived in palaces all his life, none was a better symbol of Louis XIV's grandeur than the 2,000-room chateau of Versailles.
Versailles was a stage for the display of power. The whole organisation of Versailles, the painted chambers with on the ceiling scenes of military glory associated with Louis XIV, the big room with all the mirrors. These were designed as stages for Louis's majesty in order to show his power before his subjects and before visitors.
Versailles was a great show of France's strength. But the power of the king's court was clearly illustrated by wealth of a different kind.
His wealth also had to be measured in very direct terms in the kind of military power he could put on the chessboard of Europe, if you will. France was probably the greatest military power.
Louis XIV took control of Dutch territory that today is part of Holland, attacked the Spanish Netherlands and captured part of Flanders and Luxembourg, and he seized Alsace-Lorraine from the Holy Roman Empire.
He could date the day upon which a city that was besieged would fall, and he would invite the ladies and gentlemen of the court to come out and watch the fall of the city. So even warfare for him was spectacle.
King Louis kept his country at war for almost his entire reign, and some of his most brutal battles were waged against his own people.
There is a passage in Madame de Sévigny's journal in which she comments on how many trees are lean to one side of the roads, and that was because, as she notes, so many peasants had been hung from those trees.
King Louis XIV died in 1715 at the age of 77. On his deathbed he said, "I have loved war too much." Despite the bloodshed, he is remembered as the king of all kings, the quintessential example of the grand monarch.
Louis XIV was central in creating the modern nation-state as a concept in Europe. The length of his reign, the cultural and political things he did, the consequences of his reign just mark him as one of the decisive figures in European and therefore world history.
But the accomplishments of King Louis XIV seem almost trivial compared to a tyrant to the east, a man who dictated the way his citizens dressed, shaved, and even socialized. Peter the Great's new Russian capital, St. Petersburg, was thought of as the Venice of the North. Today, elegant bridges cross quiet canals. Plazas are decorated with marble fountains and statues. But in the late 17th century, when Peter came to power as a teenager, the Russia that he inherited was both primitive and poor.
It was on the periphery of Europe and also on the periphery of Asia. It had got stuck between the two worlds in the most unfortunate and unproductive manner.
But Peter saw potential just to the west. His goal was to turn Russia into a country as wealthy, civilized, and powerful as the great nation-states of Europe. There was only one thing standing in his way. Russia had no access to the ocean.
If you look at a map of that era, you understand it's only a few miles from the Baltic. It's only a few miles from the Black Sea. Just needs to bust it out and to open up Russia's possibilities for marketing its goods and to accumulate a treasury and then to build and accumulate an army to protect itself.
Peter had only two things to work with: his own iron will and the slave labor of thousands of peasants. So around 1695, he set about building ships and training sailors to man Russia's first navy.
In some sense, Peter was the first totalitarian leader, really, who started thinking how to use masses to bring his empire to the peak of influence and might.
Peter literally built ships with his own two hands, working on the docks as a carpenter. His passion for hands-on experience permeated every aspect of his reign as Tsar.
Louis XIV wouldn't have known which end of the cannon the ball came out of. And here's Peter down there saying, "Get out of the way, I could fire that gun better than you. I can build that ship better than you."
In 1709, Peter and his new navy finally secured the window to Europe that he had so desperately wanted. His troops defeated the Swedish army, and Russia took control of Estonia, Latvia, and part of Finland. Peter had already started building his new capital of St. Petersburg in the middle of this conquered land. It was both a capital city grand enough to impress all of Europe, and the ultimate statement of Peter's power.
Peter was trying to make an announcement to all his enemies and to all his friends in the West that the opening to the Baltic and Russia's communication with the rest of Europe was not negotiable. I'm moving my capital there. You don't just win this province back. You destroy me. You take me down. And you better understand that when you come against me, you're coming against me big time.
Peter knew that if Russia was going to be modern, it had to look modern. So he built new roads, canals, and schools, and turned the long-held traditions of his country upside down. Peter's sweeping social reforms affected every aspect of Russian life. Men were ordered to shave their traditional long beards, and when the aristocrats refused, Peter personally cut them off himself. He changed everything from personal hygiene to the clothes people wore on their backs. Not even the Russian Orthodox Church was safe from Peter's dictates.
The decree was confiscate all the church bells in North Russia. I need artillery. Nothing ever said the more pragmatic character of Peter than that. It wasn't about whether there's a Trinity or not. It wasn't about the divinity of Christ. It was about, you've got my money, and I need your resources.
The message was clear. The Tsar was to be obeyed without hesitation. Peter ruled the country with personal strength. And like King Louis XIV had done before him, Peter ruthlessly crushed revolts, mounting dead bodies and severed heads on the exterior walls of the Kremlin.
People who were watching him in those moments suspected that he was insane. His pleasure at the suffering of his enemies was too obvious and too deep.
In 1725, his reign of violence finally ended. After years of terrorizing his people, Peter the Great died of an intestinal illness. He was 53. Peter the Great had looked to the West as a model for what his country should be. But even the strongest European nation could crumble. It happened in 1789 when France erupted in revolution, and Napoleon Bonaparte stepped onto the scene. He is one of the most controversial figures in the history of France. Hailed as a brilliant military leader who brought much-needed reform to the empire. Scorned as a self-obsessed despot who plundered the resources of the country for his own personal gain. Napoleon Bonaparte rode the wave of unrest after the French Revolution. He seized the reins of government in 1799 and helped implement reforms that had been started during the Revolution. Bonaparte standardized French civil law into what would become known as the Napoleonic Code. He improved the education system, made peace with the Roman Catholic Church, and founded a national bank. By 1804, Napoleon had declared himself Emperor Napoleon I. But he didn't want to rule his kingdom from high on a throne. He wanted to do it from the battlefield. The man known best as the Little General wanted military glory. Brute force had worked for Alexander the Great 2,000 years earlier, and even for Peter the Great only 100 years earlier. But in the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution started to usher in changes in everything, from the way people communicated to the way they fought wars. Changes in transportation made it easier for Napoleon to mobilize troops. He used watches and clocks to coordinate strategic events, and printing presses to copy battle plans and maps. Western powers created strong alliances and remained, for the most part, at peace.
What you get is the spread of civil society. And civil society is a constitutional government in which, if you have a king, he's still under the law rather than above the law.
Europe was changing, but Napoleon Bonaparte was still playing by the old rules. He couldn't stop waging war, and in the end, it would be his undoing.
Napoleon is unable to appreciate that the purpose of war is securing a lasting beneficial political settlement in which you get your way. All Napoleon can do is fight wars to achieve peaces, which he then breaks as quickly as possible to set out on a new set of goals. And in the end, that goes wrong. It's never enough for him.
So the European powers united against him. Prussia joined Russia, Britain, Austria, and Sweden. By 1815, Napoleon's forces were crushed, and the war was over. He was banished to an obscure rocky outcropping in the South Atlantic, where he died in 1821. Napoleon's remains languished on the island for almost 20 years. But in 1840, his coffin was relocated to one of the most prominent squares in Paris. 1 million people lined the streets to watch the glorious ceremony that marked his interment.
In a modern context, we should recognize the irony that somebody who did something like he did would be condemned by most of the world. But because he brought a certain amount of stability and an enormous amount of glory to France, which suddenly spread the tricolor all over Europe, he has this heroic stature.
The conquerors of the 20th century could hardly be called heroic. Their thirst for power both horrified the world and united it in opposition. In January 1991, the Persian Gulf War unfolded live on television sets around the world. The United States Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, Egypt, Syria, and France joined 30 other countries to fight off the threats of one man, President Saddam Hussein of Iraq. In a matter of months, the Allied forces had dealt a crushing blow to Hussein's military campaign in the tiny Arab emirate of Kuwait. But world opposition didn't deter his thirst for power. In fact, it pushed him to greater levels of oppression. Hussein continued to rule his country with an iron fist, enjoying his dozens of palaces and a personal wealth estimated at over $5 billion. He is a modern-day tyrant, a throwback to the days when powerful men built vast empires with violence and intimidation, when wealth and power were won by ruthless leaders or bestowed from one family member to the next.
Now, in the modern world, those things do still matter, but increasingly power in the modern world becomes a matter of military mobilization, economic capability, bureaucratic control, and control of means of communication. In other words, power in the modern world becomes a far more complicated technological phenomenon than it had been in the ancient world.
It is no longer possible to carve out new empires where powerful ones already exist.
No nation will be permitted to brutally assault its neighbor.
Saddam Hussein's foray into Kuwait lasted only 7 months. So today's tyrants focus their power inward, using everything available to control the people in their own countries.
The modern government has availability of information to know where people are, know what they own, to, in other words, have a surveillance of them that was inconceivable for Louis XIV or Napoleon. And also a modern government has an infrastructure of power and of strength, of civil service, control over telecommunications, which was just absent in the past.
In the 800 years since Genghis Khan tried to conquer the world, technology and global politics have made the moniker universal ruler or master of all lands all but obsolete.
There's no single person in the world who will have the kind of single-handed power that Genghis Khan had, but we don't need to look back that many centuries. We can say that there's no one in the world today with the power of people who were alive in our lifetimes. Stalin, Mao, and going back a little earlier, Hitler. Those men, the three biggest dictators of the century, will not be rivaled again because they wrought their oppressiveness on vast panoramas. Today's tyrants, odious as they are punks compared to Hitler, Stalin, and Mao.
Today's tyrants may operate on a smaller scale, but the damage they cause in their quest for wealth and power is just as real. The riches they plunder are no longer spread among the people like Genghis Khan or used to build a grand capital city like Peter the Great. They are wired to hidden Swiss bank accounts or used to line the pockets of a select few. It happens over and over again in the Philippines and Serbia, Zaire and Haiti. In Kosovo, millions of Albanians were forced into refugee camps. Thousands killed, entire cities destroyed. Mass graves and burnt buildings only hint at the destruction caused by the man they call the Butcher of the Balkans. He is President Slobodan Milosevic of Yugoslavia. His wars have not built a new empire, but devastated his country and brutalized his people.
The Don Corleones of this world, who are essentially running rackets at the expense largely of their own domestic populations, the only point of most of these regimes is the personal profit of the dictator and his family, and their power can really be measured in the number of pairs of expensive designer shoes their wives own.
That was the case in 1986, when Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos was ousted after 20 years in office. Mobs stormed Malacañang Palace, breaking through gates and pushing past soldiers. For years, the Marcos family lived in splendor, while half of the country's 50 million people lived in poverty, some searching for food in city garbage dumps. It was the same story in Zaire in May 1997, when Tutsi rebels took control of the government and forced President Mobutu Sese Seko out of the country. For the 31 years of his iron rule, Mobutu lined his pockets with money gained from Zaire's diamond, copper, and cobalt mines. The World Bank estimated that in the 1980s, up to $400 million a year in export revenue mysteriously vanished. And in May 1998, Indonesia's President Suharto was forced from office at the age of 76, leaving that country's economy in ruins. Reports claim that during his 30-year reign, $73 billion passed through his family's hands.
It's a very interesting question to ask yourself, what drives people to be so repressive for their own gain, because in the end they almost all end the same way, either out of power or in exile or in prison or killed. And yet in the 20th century, time and time again, innocent people have been uprooted by the megalomaniacal designs of people like Hitler, Stalin, Saddam Hussein, Milosevic, and so on. These are very strange things because it isn't necessary to do this to people in order to rule.
The quest for wealth and power has never been without its casualties. Alexander the Great destroyed entire cities. Genghis Khan slaughtered millions. Peter the Great used his own people for slave labor. In the modern world, we expect our leaders to rule in a more civilized manner, and most do. But there will always be some who are so seduced by the possibilities of unlimited wealth and absolute power that nothing will stand in their way.
Napoleon once tried to explain his desire for unbridled power. I love power, he said, as a musician loves his violin. The British writer Edmund Burke said there's a natural reluctance to give up authority. Those who have been intoxicated with power, he said, can never willingly abandon it. But in the newly formed United States, President George Washington, who could easily have been elected time and again, chose to relinquish power after just 2 terms. Washington, who refuted Burke's argument, set an example for the world.
In an age of change, of new modes of transportation and industrialization, there were men who built huge business empires. Single-minded in their drive to succeed, these great American tycoons would become richer than royalty and more powerful than presidents.
Vanderbilt, Astor, Carnegie, Morgan, Rockefeller, tycoons who were reviled as robber barons, revered as business geniuses. They built the infrastructure of a modern America. At the same time, they were building their own massive fortunes. Our program is the story of 5 men who monopolized entire industries and had more power than the president. Most started with nothing, but wound up having almost everything.
village of Waldorf, Germany, in 1763, John Jacob Astor was an ambitious young man who emigrated to America when he was only 20. He came with little more than the clothes on his back and a dream of making a better life.
When Astor first arrived in New York, he spoke English with a very strong German accent. He was uneducated, I would say uncouth, but really dedicated to the idea of making a fortune.
A fellow traveler had told Astor that a man could get rich in the fur trade business. So, that was the business he decided to pursue. In Astor's time, fur trading was a dangerous job. Traders traveled alone in uncharted wilderness. They went from one Indian tribe to another, offering cheap trinkets in exchange for animal pelts. Very quickly, young Astor would come to be known as a shrewd negotiator, though some say he used underhanded methods to get good deals.
His corporate policy, if you will, was to ply the Indians with liquor, get them as drunk as possible, take their furs off them for next to nothing, of course, then sell them on the East Coast, and make a substantial profit doing it, of course.
Astor's company was based in New York, the hub of a very active fur trade.
The market for furs was enormous in the early 19th century. You have to remember that people were living in cold houses, they were traveling in cold carriages, stagecoaches. They didn't have heaters. Fur robes are what kept them warm, fur coats, fur trim on their clothing. But the biggest demand for beaver pelts particularly were in top hats. Men's black top hats were made out of sheared beaver pelt, and they were worn by middle-class and wealthy men all over America.
With such a tremendous demand for furs, Astor's business flourished, and by 1800, the Astor Fur Company was one of the most profitable in the country. But for a man as ambitious as Astor, this was just the beginning. His grand plan was to set up a network of trading posts around the world.
He was one of the first American entrepreneurs to think in terms of a global empire, to think in terms of global trade.
In 1811, Astor established Astoria, the first trading post west of the Rockies, located in what is now Oregon. From Astoria, Astor exported furs to the Far East. He sent ships loaded with pelts to China, and they returned filled with tea, exotic spices, and precious silks.
It was an enormously lucrative trade. A person could send a boatload of skins to China and pay for the ship, pay for the cargo, and have enough money nearly to retire on just on one voyage.
Astor was raking in money when the United States declared war on England, setting off the War of 1812. The British quickly gained control of Astoria, putting a halt to Astor's Far East trading business. But even in wartime, this shrewd businessman found a way to turn a profit. When the U.S. government made a $16 million bond offering to raise money to fight the British, Astor and two partners bought $10 million worth. Astor liked people to believe he did it for patriotic reasons, but his motive was more self-serving.
Astor was a man who's not going to do anything without a profit. That's his motivating force in his life. That's his genius. He knows where the profit is. So by taking on some of the U.S. war debt during the War of 1812, sure, he's there to be a good citizen, but he's in it for the money.
Astor and his partners made money all right. They sold the war bonds for a profit estimated as high as $2 million, a huge sum in those days. In the years following the war, Astor, who had a nose for making money, began seriously investing in Manhattan real estate. Buying land would prove so profitable that in 1834, 71-year-old Astor decided to sell his fur company and put everything into real estate.
When other people thought of New York, for example, as a prosperous village, he was thinking of New York as a major city, as the center of commerce in America, if not the Western world.
At the time, only the southern tip of Manhattan was developed. So Astor began buying large tracts of land between Greenwich Village and the Bronx.
He understands that if you get up there first and you buy up this now worthless farmland, then all you have to do is sit and wait. And he does. And lo and behold, the value of the land goes to the ceiling.
And as the value of his land rose, Astor didn't sell. Instead, he made a fortune leasing the land for higher rents.
And by the 1830s and 1840s, he's developed this perpetual money-making machine. And it just feeds on itself. The rents pay for the new land, which brings in the new rents.
By 1838, Astor was one of the largest private landowners in the city, a position that gave him tremendous power.
He has control over the real estate of the biggest boom town in America. There are thousands of people immigrating here. The population is doubling every 15 years. And who controls the rent? Who controls the property? It's Astor. He is a very powerful man.
Astor's success made him a prime target for charities. But as someone who had spent his life amassing money, he never parted with it easily.
One time a group of people came to his office and asked for a donation to some worthy cause, and Astor rather grumpily wrote out a check for $50. And the men looked at it with some dismay and said, "But Mr. Astor, even your son William has given $100. And Astor said, "Oh well, William has a rich man for a father."
When he died in 1848, at the age of 84, John Jacob Astor, the German immigrant who had arrived in America with nothing, was by far the richest man in the country.
$100,000 made you very, very rich before the Civil War, and Astor left a fortune of at least $20 million. And so he was the Bill Gates of his day. I mean, he was inconceivably rich.
In his will, Astor did make one major philanthropic bequest. He left $400,000 to build the New York Public Library. But the bulk of his fortune went to his son, William Backhouse Astor. A chip off the old block, William, who came to be known as the landlord of New York, would double the Astor fortune in his lifetime. John Jacob Astor was the first truly rich American, but industrialization would give rise to a new breed of tycoon who would amass even more money and power. Cornelius Vanderbilt, born in 1794, grew up on this small farm on Staten Island, New York. But farm life was far too dull for Vanderbilt. Growing up on an island, he was always fascinated by the sea. At 16, he borrowed $100 from his mother to buy a boat, so he could go into business for himself.
What he does is he sets up a little ferry, a sort of a flatboat, and he pulls and sails his family's goods across from Staten Island to Manhattan. And then he develops this into a regular ferry system. The Staten Island Ferry, of now contemporary fame, is really Vanderbilt's invention.
Vanderbilt had entered a very competitive business, but as someone who stood more than 6 feet tall, he could hold his own in the rough world of the dock.
It helped Vanderbilt a lot. He was this big, strapping guy who could handle himself in any circumstance. He was quite a formidable character, and he often had to use his fist to break into business.
As well as being tough, Vanderbilt was a hard-working sailor. Nicknamed the Commodore by his competitors, he ran his boat on a strict schedule and put in longer hours than anyone else. In 1812, the United States went to war with England, and Vanderbilt, known as the most fearless and reliable ferryman in New York, won a very lucrative government contract.
When the federal government needed somebody to deliver supplies to the various forts that protected New York City from attack from the British, they hired Vanderbilt, even though his bid was not the lowest, because they knew he would do the job. And this was Vanderbilt's reputation throughout his life.
Vanderbilt used the money he made during the war to build a small fleet of boats. But by 1818, his business began dropping off as bigger, more powerful steamships started cutting into his territory. The Commodore wasted no time building his own steamship line, and then he proceeded to put his competitors out of business.
He had a route from New York City up to Albany along the Hudson River, and he kept cutting prices to undercut his rival until there was a point where he was transporting passengers for free.
Vanderbilt lost money this way, but his larger rivals offering free passage on their ships lost even more. Finally, in desperation, his competitors paid Vanderbilt $150,000 not to operate his ships along their routes.
He just loved the game of making money. He enjoyed it. The money was not particularly interesting to him. It was the winning. He loved to win, and he almost always did.
In 1853, some of Vanderbilt's associates learned just how hard it was to beat the Commodore. Vanderbilt was on vacation when they took over one of his most profitable shipping routes. When he discovered their treachery, the Commodore wrote them a now famous letter. "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I will not sue you, for the law takes too long. I will ruin you." And he did. Vanderbilt regained his roots, and within a year, his rivals were out of business. By 1864, Vanderbilt was the most powerful steamship operator in the country. At 70, he was rich enough to retire. But just as John Astor changed businesses late in life, Vanderbilt sold his steamship company and invested all his money in a new mode of transportation, railroad.
Vanderbilt realized that railroads were the wave of the future. He realized that railroads were stealing a lot of his traffic. If he was going to remain an important figure in transportation, he needed to get into railroads. And so he did.
Vanderbilt, who always thought big, was one of the first railroad owners to envision a network.
What he tries to do is to put together little small bits of railroad and forge a united system out of them. And he does.
Vanderbilt would manage his railroads just as efficiently as he had his steamships. Unlike some of his competitors, he knew from experience that good service leads to more customers.
In fact, he is one of the few who takes some of the profits and doesn't just simply run off and spend them, although he certainly does spend a lot of money, but he also puts them back into developing and improving the service.
By 1870, Vanderbilt's railroad empire stretched more than 700 miles from the Great Lakes to the East Coast.
His line at New York Central was not only the most powerful railroad in this country, it was the largest railroad in the world. And he was the most powerful railroad man in the world, probably, and certainly the richest.
The tough old Commodore, who had been such a vital force in American business for so many years, died in 1877 at the age of 82. At the time, his estate was valued at more than $100 million, more money than was in the U.S. Treasury. Vanderbilt, like John Astor, had little interest in charity. He made only one gift, a $1 million donation to Central University in Nashville, now known as Vanderbilt University. The Commodore left the bulk of his estate to his oldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt. A shrewd businessman in his own right, he doubled his father's fortune in just 6 years. In 1971, Vanderbilt's powerful New York Central was folded into Amtrak. But the Commodore's vision of a country linked by rail remains his greatest legacy.
Vanderbilt was one of the people who helped knit the American country together through transportation. It had always been a problem for Americans that they lived in this great big country. How to hold the country together was a problem. Through his sailboats, through his steamboats, through his railroad. Vanderbilt helped tie the country together in a way that allowed America to become the powerful country it became.
Andrew Carnegie was born in 1835 in a small Scottish village called Dunfermline, the center of a centuries-old linen industry. As a young boy, Andrew thought he would be a handloom weaver like his father. But in the 1840s, machines put these hand craftsmen out of work. The Carnegie family was nearly destitute when Andrew's mother, Margaret, decided they would emigrate to America. Margaret had relatives living in Pittsburgh, where they settled in 1848. Andrew was 12 when he got his first job at a textile factory, working 12-hour days for $1.20 a week. But his mother let him know she expected more from him.
Carnegie's mother goaded him by telling him repeatedly that his father had failed, and that she herself felt the humiliation of that failure, and that she wanted redemption simply through his success.
Spurred on by his mother, Andrew spent his free time educating himself at a local library. And within a year, he managed to land a better job at a telegraph company. It was there that the ambitious young man amazed everyone by teaching himself to decipher Morse code by ear.
My boy, as far as I know, there are only two people in the whole world who can take a message straight from the key.
Thank you, Mr. Scott.
Young Carnegie soon caught the attention of Tom Scott, a top executive at the Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the largest railroads in the country. In 1852, Scott hired Carnegie to be his clerk and personal telegrapher, a job that gave this 17-year-old a bird's-eye view of big business.
He was able to watch the mighty of the land as they ran one of the largest businesses in the country, and that taught him a lot, especially because it was a very well-run business.
One morning in 1855, Carnegie was alone at the telegraph desk when news came over the wire that one of the Pennsylvania's trains had crashed. To keep trains from backing up, Carnegie knew someone needed to give immediate orders to clear the wreckage, but Scott was out of the office.
Customarily then, one waited for the superintendent to reappear and give the necessary orders. But Carnegie simply sent the telegraphed orders to the line to clear the way and sign Scott's initials to the telegram, as though he were in fact Scott himself. He seized the day.
Scott was so impressed with Carnegie's quick thinking that he made the young man his protege. Scott would show Carnegie not only how to run a huge business profitably, but how to invest money. Over the next 12 years, Carnegie made tens of thousands of dollars from investments, though by today's standards he was using what is known as insider information.
Strictly speaking, a lot of his early investments by today's laws would be illegal. He got involved in the sleeping car business because he knew from his insider information with the railroads that sleeping cars were going to become widely prevalent on American railroads.
As a railroad insider, Carnegie also had advanced knowledge that the industry was about to switch from iron to steel tracks. Carnegie saw a chance to make a fortune. He opened his first steel plant in 1875 and immediately began maneuvering to take control of the entire industry.
He wanted to drive the other people out of business. Simple as that. And the way to do that was to be so efficient that you could cut your prices so low and still make money that no one could compete with you.
By 1890, Carnegie was making more than $2 million a year. And at the time, there was no income tax. $2 million was $2 million. But Carnegie, unlike other industrialists of his day, wanted to give back to society. The self-educated steel king would make libraries his signature gift.
Reading it opened the world for him. It made him a more worthwhile person, a wiser person, if you will, a person who could see beyond his own immediate concerns. And he wanted to make that possible for other people who came after him.
Carnegie also began publishing articles and books extolling American democracy and advocating the rights of the working man. Through his writings and his libraries, he came to be known as a millionaire industrialist with a working-class heart. But for all his good thoughts and deeds, conditions at Carnegie's factories were no better than anywhere else in the industry. His employees worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, with just 1 day off a year. The average annual salary was $520, barely enough for a worker to live on. In 1892, workers at Carnegie's Homestead Mill in Pennsylvania organized a strike. It started as a peaceful protest, but soon exploded into armed confrontation between thugs hired by management and the workers. 4 people died and hundreds were wounded, shattering Carnegie's image as a friend of the worker.
His beliefs came into conflict at this moment, and he chose power,
market power, money, over his previously stated beliefs in the importance of the rights of the laboring people in those plants.
Carnegie's reputation never fully recovered from Homestead, but his business kept growing. By 1900, Carnegie Steel was one of the largest companies in the world, and as chief owner, Andrew Carnegie wielded tremendous power.
He had the power to create or destroy jobs for, directly and indirectly, hundreds of thousands of people. He had the power to affect the economic well-being of whole cities and towns. And he could do that just on the basis of his own desires, his own decision. There's no one alive today who exercises a similar power.
But at the peak of his power in 1901, Carnegie shocked the world when he accepted an offer from financier J.P. Morgan to buy Carnegie Steel.
Morgan sent an emissary to Carnegie to ask him his price for his steelworks, and Carnegie scribbled on a scrap of paper. The paper was taken back to Morgan, who looked at it and promptly said, "I accept that price."
That price was $480 million. At the time, the biggest buyout in U.S. history. When Morgan handed Carnegie the check, he congratulated him on being the richest man in the world. Selling his company allowed Carnegie, who was now 65, to devote all his time to giving away his millions.
Carnegie, at an early age, decided that he would not die rich. As he famously said, the man who dies rich dies disgraced. He had this notion that a person should spend the first half of his life making money and the second half of his life giving his money away.
By the time he died in 1919 at the age of 84, Carnegie had given 90%, or roughly $350 million, to charity. The remaining 10% was divided between his wife and daughter and the Carnegie Foundation, which has continued his philanthropic work. Today, there are more than 3,000 Carnegie libraries around the world.
The first library I ever took a book out of was a Carnegie library. I don't know how many of us there are in the world who can say that, but certainly an enormous number. How did that affect the world? Hard to know, but it seems inconceivable that it didn't affect the lives of millions of people over time.
Born in this house in Hartford, Connecticut in 1837, John Pierpont Morgan had a far more privileged upbringing than the other tycoons we've heard about. But that didn't make this young boy any less driven to succeed. His father, Junius, a wealthy banker, began pushing Pierpont at an early age to take an interest in business. So while other boys played sports, Pierpont spent his time studying account books.
At 7 or 8, he would go to his father's office with him and sort of learn about account books and interest rates, and it's rather comical, sort of a central casting life.
In 1854, Pierpont's parents sent him to boarding school in Switzerland, where he quickly distinguished himself.
He was quite a natural leader. Very early on, he was the one in charge of whatever was going on. He took command of sporting expeditions. He organized card games and hikes. So he was definitely the person who took charge.
In 1857, Morgan got his first job as a clerk in a New York bank. He was only 20 at the time, but that didn't stop this ambitious young man from trying to run things. When his bosses sent him to New Orleans to buy cotton, Morgan came across a shipload of coffee at a bargain price. He bought it on the spot. His bosses were furious. That is, until they found out about the huge profit Morgan made on the resale.
Morgan was very sure that the way he wanted to do things was the right way to do them. He didn't stop and wonder, gee, should I do this or should I do that? He just saw what he thought needed to be done, and he did it.
In 1861, Morgan left the bank to go into business for himself. Working with his father, now a leading American banker in London, Morgan specialized in finding Europeans to invest in American businesses.
It's important to remember that Europe was the source of capital. The United States was a developing country that didn't have extra capital.
Pierpont working in New York and his father Junius working in London found very good properties to represent, and once they took responsibility for them, they followed through.
If a company Morgan backed went bankrupt, he would hire new managers and monitor it until it was back in the black. In this way, he gained a reputation as someone who always made a profit for his investors.
His word was good. He did what he said he was going to do. So over time, both the other leading bankers of the world and the investors in Europe, on whom the U.S. was dependent at that time, they all learned to trust him, and that gave him tremendous power.
It wasn't long before Morgan had established himself as one of the top financiers of his day. He had a hand in financing just about every major deal, including Thomas Edison's first electric light company.
Morgan was the first of the real important finance capitalists. If Astor was a merchant capitalist and Carnegie was industrial capitalist, Morgan was a financial capitalist. And he realized, before anybody else, that whoever controlled money controlled everything else.
In 1879, Morgan extended his control even further by focusing on America's biggest growth industry, railroads. He quickly came to dominate the railroads by demanding that in exchange for investment capital, they give him a seat on their boards of directors.
Once he got onto the boards of the railroads, he quickly made clear to the other members of the boards that he was smarter, that he had greater insight, that he knew what the railroads ought to do.
Morgan's position as both banker and board member gave him incredible influence, so that by the 1890s, he was one of the most powerful men in the country.
J.P. Morgan arguably had more power than any other private citizen in American history. He controlled 1/3 of America's railways. This at a time when railways comprised 60% of all the stocks in the New York Stock Exchange. He controlled the 3 largest insurance companies, much of the shipping on the North Atlantic.
Morgan had the power, directly or indirectly, to hire and fire hundreds of thousands of workers, and businesses across the country relied on his railroads to deliver their goods. The general public came to fear Morgan. Few men have ever had such a stranglehold on the American economy, and even his appearance was intimidating.
He was a man who had a booming voice. He had this icy, pitiless gaze. And of course, most unforgettably, he had this great red disfigured nose.
As he got older, a hereditary skin disease turned Morgan's nose into a monstrosity.
It made him quite frightening to me. You couldn't greet him without looking at his nose, and he had a kind of defiant glare that challenged you to look him square in the face and not flinch at the sight.
Morgan was powerful enough to insist that only photos in which his nose had been retouched were ever printed. But a few slipped past his control. Morgan's overwhelming power made him so unpopular with the general public that politicians wanted nothing to do with him. But in 1895, when the U.S. government's gold supply dropped dangerously low, President Grover Cleveland had no choice but to ask Morgan for help. Only Morgan could raise funds fast enough to prevent the U.S. economy from collapsing.
Morgan was the only one who commanded the resources, who commanded the confidence of moneyed people around the world to pull it off. He knew it, President Cleveland knew it, everybody knew it.
It took Morgan just a couple of days to round up enough European investors to buy roughly $60 million in government bonds. Morgan had averted a national crisis. But as people pointed out, his motive was not entirely altruistic.
J.P. Morgan wasn't acting from a benign interest in helping the country. J.P. Morgan was out for himself, and he took a very hefty commission for when he sold the U.S. government's bonds to the Europeans. He didn't do it for free.
Morgan would spend the last years of the 19th century consolidating smaller companies into larger, more successful corporations. He oversaw the creation of such corporate giants as General Electric, International Harvester, and AT&T. And then, in 1901, the jewel in the crown, he combined Andrew Carnegie's steel operations with other mills to create U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. Morgan had reached the peak of his power by 1907, when the country got caught in another economic crisis. And once again, a U.S. president, this time Theodore Roosevelt, would call on Morgan for help. The crisis began when a major New York commercial bank collapsed, causing a run on other banks. To stop the panic, Morgan decided to set up a rescue fund to prevent the crisis from spreading nationwide.
Morgan assembled all of the city's bankers in his very ornate library, and he locked the doors, pocketed the key, and told the bankers that they could not leave until they had come up with $25 million for this rescue fund. And finally, around 5 o'clock in the morning, the bankers agreed to contribute to this fund, and Morgan was nice enough to let them go home and get some sleep.
Once again, Morgan had used his personal influence to save the U.S. economy. Even President Teddy Roosevelt, a well-known enemy of monopoly, commended Morgan for his role.
And for about a minute, he was a national hero. As he walked down Wall Street, people cheered. But a minute after that, the exercise of that much power by one private citizen really horrified a nation of Democrats. And eventually it led to the setting up of the Federal Reserve.
In 1913, J.P. Morgan died in his sleep. He was 75 years old. At the time, everyone had just assumed Morgan was spectacularly wealthy. So the news that his estate was valued at just $80 million, far less than Carnegie's hundreds of millions, came as a shock. As John D. Rockefeller was said to have remarked, and to think, he wasn't even a rich man. Morgan left all his money to his family and divided his extensive art collection among museums in New York and Hartford. But while J.P. Morgan may not be remembered as America's wealthiest tycoon, his power was indisputable.
Nobody could have that much power today, to be the raiser of capital and the unofficial central banker of the country. It's just unimaginable. There are federal agencies that do some of those jobs, but one private banker doing that for 20 years is quite astonishing.
John D. Rockefeller, born in 1839 in this humble house in upstate New York, did not have an easy childhood. Growing up, he was always torn between the influence of his mother and his father.
He had, I think it's safe to say, the most bizarrely mismatched parents imaginable. His mother, Eliza, was very thrifty and prudent and disciplined, and she schooled him in hard work and introduced him to the Baptist Church. Rockefeller's father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a colorful rascal who was a con man and a snake oil artist.
Rockefeller's father spent most of his time on the road selling phony miracle cures. Meanwhile, his wife and children lived in a constant state of worry, never knowing if he would stop in and pay off their mounting debts. Young John, who became devoutly religious, was embarrassed by his father's scandalous behavior and determined not to follow in his footsteps.
I think that because he was the son of the town pariah and undoubtedly subjected to a lot of malicious gossip, I think that he really had a very exaggerated need for respectability, and I think that this was one thing behind his drive for wealth and power.
In 1853, the Rockefellers moved to Cleveland, where John worked for a short time at a commodities firm before starting his own trading company. Rockefeller's company was profitable from the start, but it would become even more so in 1863, when John got the bright idea to focus on a new commodity, oil. The discovery of oil in western Pennsylvania in 1859 set off a frenzy of production. Kerosene, an oil byproduct, was quickly becoming the main source of light in homes and offices across America. To cash in on this growing demand, greedy producers drilled hundreds of wells, flooding the market and forcing the price of oil down.
There were people in the hinterlands finding the oil, bringing it to market in a haphazard sort of way, and it was really waiting for somebody who would, in some sense, find a way to institutionalize the development of oil.
That somebody was 24-year-old Rockefeller, who immediately focused on refining rather than just drilling oil.
Rockefeller's great genius was to see that the money was there to be made in bringing it to market, in refining it, making it usable, because that's where you could exert the most leverage, really, in terms of making it a profitable venture.
In 1863, Rockefeller opened his first refinery in Cleveland, Ohio. The Standard Oil Company, as it came to be known, was soon the largest, most efficient refinery in the country. But Rockefeller wasn't satisfied being the biggest refiner. He wanted to be the only refiner.
To him, there was no reason why there should be several competitors in any given market. Why not take simply the best, the most efficient producer, the most efficient distributor, which of course was Standard Oil, and give them the entire market? And of course people wouldn't give it to him. He had to take it for himself. And he was ruthless in doing so.
Rockefeller, who had inherited some of his father's craftiness, went to his rival refiners and offered them a simple choice: become part of Standard Oil or else.
When Rockefeller gives you a choice, one remembers the famous phrase from The Godfather about making offers that you can't refuse.
Those who took Rockefeller up on his offer to become part of Standard Oil got rich. Those who did not found it hard to stay in business.
You might find that suddenly there were no barrels on the market for you to ship your oil. You might find that there were no chemicals in order to refine it. You might find that there was a sudden shortage of tank cars to transport your oil. So he would create artificial shortages that would make it impossible for people to compete against him.
Rockefeller also played hardball with the railroads. As one of their biggest customers, he demanded not only a discount on his own shipments, but a kickback on shipments they made for his competitors. His demands were outrageous, and in some cases illegal, but they accomplished his goal of making Standard Oil unbeatable.
There was obviously these advantages that he, in effect, extorted from the railroads that led to that just explosive growth that overnight made Standard into a kind of a wonder of the world.
By the 1890s, Standard Oil was making millions from the sale of kerosene when a new invention came along. It was called the automobile, and to Rockefeller's great delight, it consumed more petroleum in an hour than most kerosene lamps used in a month. And the car was just the beginning.
There were larger engines being built, there were huge ships, planes. Each one of these things ran on oil. This was an energy source that powered the world into the modern age, and he was the man sitting atop of the spigot, as it were.
At the peak of its power, Standard Oil refined nearly 90% of all the oil in the world. It distributed and marketed nearly 90% of the oil, and it controlled approximately one-third of the oil wells themselves.
Rockefeller's stranglehold on such a vital industry made him the target of criticism. In 1902, a journalist named Ida Tarbell wrote a series of articles attacking Rockefeller's business practices and depicting him as a greedy opportunist. Rockefeller ignored all the bad press. As far as he was concerned, his success was God's will.
Rockefeller really thought that he was rich because he deserved to be rich. He often said, God gave me my money.
But to Rockefeller, this God-given windfall came with an obligation to give back to society. In 1897, he was 58 when he began withdrawing from the day-to-day operations of Standard Oil so he could devote all his energy to giving his money away. And in the coming years, he gave millions to different schools and established a Rockefeller Institute and a foundation. In 1904, Rockefeller was still the head of Standard Oil when trust-busting President Teddy Roosevelt embarked on a campaign to break up the Standard monopoly. Roosevelt's efforts succeeded in 1911, and Standard Oil was broken up into 34 derivative companies. Rockefeller took the news calmly. At 71, he had plenty of money, but he was worried about his negative public image. He would spend his final years courting the press, trying his best to project the image of an easygoing, fun-loving guy. By the time he died in 1937, 97-year-old Rockefeller had amassed more than $900 million. Some say the largest fortune in U.S. history.
Rockefeller's fortune represented more than 2% of the gross national product of the United States, which, if he were alive today and had more than 2% of GNP, he would be worth approximately $190 billion, or about twice what Bill Gates is worth.
More than half of this vast fortune went to charity. The rest, more than $460 million, was left to Rockefeller's only son, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Jr., as he was known, made it his mission to continue his father's philanthropic efforts. The legacy of Rockefeller Standard Oil lives on in the companies it left behind, and in the antitrust and regulatory laws that changed the way Americans do business.
Rockefeller achieved the success he did largely because laws didn't exist to outlaw the practices that Standard Oil engaged in. In fact, Standard's great success caused the laws to be changed. Rockefeller changed the ground rules for himself and for everybody else.
American Heritage Magazine compiled a list of history's wealthiest tycoons by comparing their net worth to the overall economy. With that yardstick, 4 of the moguls in our program were the richest Americans in history: Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and Astor. J.P. Morgan was far down on the list with a fortune that would be worth only $25 billion today. So Rockefeller was correct when he joked about Morgan not being a very rich man.